In the glittering heart of Los Angeles, where champagne flowed freely and diamonds sparkled under crystal chandeliers, a secret lay buried for 55 years. On a warm October evening in 1970, the body of Victoria Ashford, a stunning 28-year-old heiress, was discovered in the gardens of the prestigious Brentwood Country Club. Her murder sent shockwaves through California's elite circles, but despite extensive investigations, the case went cold. The killer vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only whispers and speculation. But in 2025, a single piece of overlooked evidence would shatter carefully constructed lies and expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Los Angeles society. Victoria Ashford was more than just another wealthy socialite. Born into one of California's most prominent families, she was known for her sharp intelligence, her passion for civil rights activism, and her refusal to conform to the expectations placed upon women of her status. While her peers spent their days shopping on Rodeo Drive and planning charity galas, Victoria worked tirelessly to support marginalized communities. She funded legal aid for the poor, sponsored art programs in underprivileged neighborhoods, and used her family's influence to push for social reform. Her progressive views made her a beloved figure among activists, but they also made her enemies among the conservative elite who dominated Los Angeles high society. The night of her death, Victoria attended the annual Autumn Gala at the Brentwood Country Club, an exclusive event that brought together the city's wealthiest families. She arrived at 8 o'clock, wearing an elegant emerald gown that matched her striking green eyes. Witnesses would later recall that she seemed distracted, almost nervous. Throughout the evening, she engaged in hushed conversations with several guests, her expression growing increasingly troubled. At approximately 11:15, Victoria excused herself from the ballroom, saying she needed fresh air. She was never seen alive again. A groundskeeper discovered her body at 6:30 the following morning. She lay among the rose bushes in the club's secluded eastern garden, her emerald gown torn and stained with blood. The medical examiner determined she had been strangled, and the force used suggested the killer possessed considerable strength. But what truly puzzled investigators was the lack of defensive wounds. Victoria had not fought back, which led detectives to believe she knew her attacker and had not anticipated the violence. This detail would haunt the investigation for decades. The Los Angeles Police Department launched an immediate and thorough investigation. Lead detective Raymond Fletcher, a seasoned investigator with 20 years of experience, interviewed over 200 guests who attended the gala. Each had an alibi. Each expressed shock and grief. But beneath the surface of polished manners and carefully rehearsed statements, Fletcher sensed something darker. The socialite circle was protecting someone. He could feel it in the way certain names were avoided, in the uncomfortable silences that followed specific questions, in the subtle glances exchanged when he pressed too hard for answers. Victoria's family offered a substantial reward for information leading to the killer's arrest. Her father, Charles Ashford, a powerful real estate magnate, used every connection he possessed to keep pressure on the police department. Her mother, Eleanor, retreated into grief, refusing to speak publicly about the tragedy. Her younger brother, Thomas, only 18 at the time, swore he would never rest until justice was served. But months passed, then years, and the case grew cold. The trail of evidence led nowhere. The killer remained free. In 1975, Detective Fletcher retired, taking the case files with him in boxes that he stored in his garage. He continued to review them periodically, searching for the detail he might have missed, the connection he failed to make. But the answer eluded him until his death in 1998. The case was officially closed, relegated to the archives of unsolved murders that haunted the department. But in March of 2025, everything changed. A graduate student named Sarah Chen, researching her thesis on unsolved crimes of the 1970s, requested access to the Ashford case files. While digitizing old photographs and documents, she noticed something that every investigator before her had overlooked. In one photograph taken at the gala, visible in the background of a group shot, was a reflection in a window. The image quality was poor, and in 1970 the technology to enhance it simply did not exist. But with modern forensic imaging software, Sarah was able to clarify what the reflection showed. Victoria Ashford standing in the garden, And she was not alone. This discovery would reignite the investigation and lead detectives down a path that exposed secrets, lies and betrayals spanning more than 5 decades. The truth, when it finally emerged, would shock not only the investigators, but the entire city of Los Angeles. Sarah Chen stared at her computer screen, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the contrast on the enhanced photograph for the 3rd time. The image remained the same. In the reflection of the ballroom window, captured accidentally by the photographer who had been documenting the autumn gala, 2 figures stood in the garden. One was unmistakably Victoria Ashford, her emerald gown catching the light from the ballroom. The other figure was taller, masculine, wearing what appeared to be a dark suit. Their body language suggested an intense conversation. The man's hand rested on Victoria's shoulder, and her posture indicated discomfort, perhaps even fear. It was 11:30 on a Wednesday night when Sarah made the discovery. She sat alone in the UCLA library archives, surrounded by boxes of documents and her laptop. For hours, she had been scanning photographs, taking notes, and building a timeline of that fateful evening. She had nearly packed up for the night when she decided to run one more photograph through the enhancement software. Now sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. Sarah immediately contacted her thesis advisor, Professor Michael Brennan, a former FBI profiler who specialized in cold case analysis. By 8 the next morning, they sat together in his office, the enhanced photograph displayed on a large monitor. Professor Brennan studied it carefully, his experienced eyes catching details that Sarah had missed. He pointed to a distinctive ring visible on the man's hand in the reflection, a thick band that caught the light. He noted the man's height, which he estimated at approximately 6 feet 2 inches, based on the proportions compared to Victoria, who stood 5 feet 6 according to her medical records. Most importantly, he observed that Victoria appeared to be reaching into her purse, possibly for something specific. Professor Brennan made a phone call to Detective Lisa Martinez of the LAPD Cold Case Unit. Martinez, 42 years old and a 17-year veteran of the department, had built her reputation on solving seemingly impossible cases. She arrived at UCLA within 2 hours, accompanied by her partner, Detective James Wong, a methodical investigator known for his attention to detail. When they saw the enhanced photograph, both detectives understood immediately that they were looking at a breakthrough. Detective Martinez obtained a warrant to officially reopen the case that same afternoon. She assembled a small task force that included Detective Wong, 2 forensic specialists, and a research analyst. Their first step was to review every piece of evidence collected in 1970, but this time with modern forensic techniques and technologies that had not existed 55 years earlier. The original case files filled 12 boxes stored in the department's evidence warehouse. Among the items were photographs, witness statements, Victoria's personal belongings recovered from the scene, soil samples from the garden, and fabric fibers found on her dress. The task force established their operations in a conference room at the LAPD headquarters. They covered the walls with photographs, timelines, and charts, mapping out the relationships between Victoria and the gala attendees. Detective Martinez believed in visualization. She needed to see the entire picture laid out before her, to identify patterns and connections that might not be obvious when reviewing documents individually. Detective Wong began the painstaking process of re-interviewing every witness who was still alive. Of the 200 original witnesses, 137 remained living. Many were now in their 70s and 80s, but their memories of that night were surprisingly clear. Traumatic events, Wong knew, tended to leave lasting impressions. The forensic team made an immediate discovery when they re-examined Victoria's evening purse, which had been found near her body. Using modern chemical analysis, they detected traces of a sedative on the interior fabric. The substance was chloral hydrate, commonly known as knockout drops, a drug popular in the 1960s and 1970s. This finding suggested that Victoria may have been drugged before she was killed, which explained the lack of defensive wounds. If she had been sedated, she would have been unable to fight back effectively. Detective Martinez requested access to the Brentwood Country Club's archives, seeking any records from October 1970. The club had changed ownership 3 times since then, but remarkably, They had preserved historical documents in their library. Martinez and Wong spent an entire day reviewing guest lists, membership records, employee files, and even receipts from the bar that night. They discovered that the club had employed 23 staff members during the gala, including waiters, bartenders, groundskeepers, and security personnel. Most of those names had never been thoroughly investigated in the original case, as Detective Fletcher had focused primarily on the wealthy guests. One name stood out in the employment records: Daniel Whitmore, who had worked as a security guard at the club for only 3 months before the gala. He had resigned abruptly 2 days after Victoria's murder, citing family reasons. The original investigators had briefly questioned him, but his alibi seemed solid. He claimed he had been stationed at the front entrance throughout the evening, and multiple witnesses confirmed seeing him there. However, Detective Wong noticed something peculiar in the employment file. Whitmore's emergency contact was listed as Catherine Blackwell, a name that appeared repeatedly in the witness statements as one of Victoria's closest friends. This connection intrigued Martinez. Why would a security guard list a wealthy socialite as his emergency contact? She pulled Catherine Blackwell's original statement from 1970. Catherine had claimed she spent the entire evening in the ballroom and had not spoken to Victoria after 10 o'clock. But if she had a relationship with Whitmore, why had she not mentioned it? More importantly, why had the original investigators not discovered this connection? Detective Martinez made a note to locate Catherine Blackwell immediately. According to public records, she still lived in Los Angeles, now 79 years old, and residing in a luxury apartment building in Beverly Hills. The detective decided that their first interview would be with her. But before approaching Catherine, Martinez wanted to find Daniel Whitmore. If he was still alive, he had questions to answer. She assigned the research analyst to track him down using every database and resource available. What they would discover about Whitmore's whereabouts would complicate the investigation in ways none of them anticipated. The research analyst, Kevin Park, was a 31-year-old specialist who had helped solve 14 cold cases in his 5 years with the LAPD. He approached every search with systematic precision, beginning with the most obvious sources and gradually moving into more obscure databases. Finding Daniel Whitmore should have been straightforward. Men who were alive in 1970 left paper trails: tax records, driver's licenses, property deeds, marriage certificates, death records. But Whitmore proved to be a ghost. Kevin started with Social Security records. Daniel Whitmore, born March 15, 1945, in Sacramento, California, had a valid Social Security number that showed employment at the Brentwood Country Club from July through October 1970. After that, the records went blank. No tax returns filed, no employment reported, no activity whatsoever. It was as if Daniel Whitmore had ceased to exist on October 23, 1970. Exactly 2 days after Victoria Ashford's murder, Detective Martinez reviewed Kevin's preliminary findings with growing suspicion. People did not simply vanish without reason, especially not immediately after a murder they were connected to, however tangentially. She asked Kevin to expand his search nationally, checking for any Daniel Whitmore matching the age and physical description from the employment records. The club's file indicated Whitmore stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighed 185 pounds, had brown hair and blue eyes. According to the photograph stapled to his employment application, he was strikingly handsome with sharp features and an athletic build. Kevin ran the search through federal databases, including military records, since men of Whitmore's age would have been draft eligible during the Vietnam War. He found no record of Daniel Whitmore serving in any branch of the military. No criminal record existed under that name. No driver's license renewals, no passport applications, no credit history beyond 1970. The absence of information was itself information. Someone had deliberately erased Daniel Whitmore's existence, or Daniel Whitmore was not his real name. While Kevin continued his search, Detective Martinez and Detective Wong decided to visit Catherine Blackwell. They made the drive to Beverly Hills on a Thursday afternoon, arriving at the prestigious Wilshire Corridor building where Catherine maintained her residence. The building's concierge announced their arrival, and Catherine agreed to see them immediately. She lived on the 14th floor in a spacious apartment filled with antiques, expensive artwork, and photographs documenting a life lived among Los Angeles elite. Catherine Blackwell greeted them at her door. At 79, she remained elegant, her white hair perfectly styled, her posture erect. She wore a cream-colored suit and pearl jewelry. Her eyes, however, showed wariness when she saw the detectives' badges. She invited them into her living room, offering tea, which they politely declined. Martinez noticed that Catherine's hands shook slightly as she sat down in a velvet armchair. Detective Martinez began gently, explaining that new evidence had emerged in Victoria Ashford's case. Catherine's expression remained carefully neutral, but Martinez, trained to read micro-expressions, caught the brief flash of fear that crossed the older woman's face. Wong took notes while Martinez asked Catherine to recount her memories of that October evening in 1970. Catherine's version matched her original statement almost word for word. She had arrived at the gala at 8 o'clock, spent the evening socializing with friends, and had last seen Victoria around 10 o'clock near the bar. She claimed to have been shocked and devastated when she learned of Victoria's death the next morning. Then Martinez asked the question that changed everything. She asked Catherine about Daniel Whitmore. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Catherine's composed facade cracked. Her face went pale, and for several seconds she appeared unable to speak. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. She asked how they knew about Daniel. Martinez explained about the employment records, about the emergency contact listing. Catherine closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, tears had formed. What Catherine revealed over the next hour would reshape the entire investigation. Daniel Whitmore was not just a security guard. He was Catherine's nephew, the son of her deceased sister. Catherine had helped him get the job at the Brentwood Country Club because he needed money. But Daniel had not been what he seemed. Catherine confessed that in the weeks before Victoria's murder, she had discovered that Daniel was involved in something dangerous. He had asked her strange questions about Victoria's schedule, about her habits, about who she spent time with. Catherine had confronted him, and Daniel had become angry, telling her to stay out of his business. On the night of the gala, Catherine had seen something that haunted her for 55 years. Around 11 o'clock, she had stepped onto the terrace for air. From her vantage point, she could see part of the eastern garden. She saw Victoria walking toward the rose bushes, and she saw Daniel following her at a distance. Catherine's instinct told her something was wrong, but she hesitated. By the time she decided to investigate, both Victoria and Daniel had disappeared into the darker section of the garden. Catherine returned to the ballroom, telling herself she was being paranoid. When she learned of Victoria's death the next morning, Catherine immediately suspected Daniel. She went to his apartment, a small studio near Culver City that she was paying for, but he was gone. All his belongings had been removed. She never saw or heard from him again. Catherine admitted she should have told the police, but fear paralyzed her. If Daniel had killed Victoria, what might he do to her? Moreover, she worried about her own reputation. Being associated with a murderer, even as a family member, would destroy her standing in society. So she remained silent, carrying the guilt for more than 5 decades. Detective Martinez asked Catherine if she had any photographs of Daniel, anything that might help identify him. Catherine nodded and retrieved a small photo album from a drawer. Inside were several pictures of Daniel from family gatherings. Martinez studied them carefully. The man in these photographs matched the employment photo from the country club file, but there was something else. The ring. In one photograph, Daniel wore a distinctive ring on his right hand, a thick silver band with an unusual design. It appeared to be the same ring visible in the enhanced photograph from the gala. Detective Wong asked Catherine if Daniel had any close friends, anyone who might know where he went. Catherine mentioned one name, Marcus Sullivan, another security guard at the club who had been friendly with Daniel. According to Catherine, Marcus had also left his job shortly after the murder, though she did not know what became of him. This new lead gave the investigation a fresh direction. If they could find Marcus Sullivan, he might lead them to Daniel Whitmore. As Martinez and Wong prepared to leave, Catherine made one final confession. She said that for 55 years, she had been receiving letters, anonymous letters mailed from different cities, never with a return address. The letters contained only 3 words: "I am watching." Catherine believed they came from Daniel, a reminder that she should keep her silence. She had saved every letter, dozens of them, stored in a box in her closet. She gave the box to Detective Martinez, hoping that after all these years, her silence could finally end. The forensic laboratory at LAPD headquarters occupied the entire 3rd floor of the building, a maze of sterile rooms filled with sophisticated equipment. Detective Martinez delivered the box of letters to senior forensic analyst Dr. Patricia Reynolds on Friday morning. Dr. Reynolds, a specialist in document analysis with 23 years of experience, understood immediately the potential value of what she held. 55 years of correspondence, even brief anonymous messages, could yield tremendous information about the sender. Dr. Reynolds began her examination systematically. The box contained 63 letters total, spanning from November 1970 to as recently as March 2025. Each envelope bore a postmark from a different city: Phoenix, Seattle, Denver, Houston, Atlanta, Boston, Miami. The sender had moved frequently, never staying in one location long enough to establish a pattern. The letters themselves were identical in content. 3 typewritten words on plain white paper: "I am watching." No signature, no additional message. Just those 3 words that had terrorized Catherine Blackwell for decades. The forensic team extracted DNA from the envelope adhesive where the sender had sealed each letter. In 1970, DNA analysis did not exist as an investigative tool, but in 2025 it was standard procedure. Dr. Reynolds found usable DNA samples on 41 of the 63 envelopes. She immediately submitted them to the National DNA Database, hoping for a match. The results would take several days, but Martinez remained optimistic. If Daniel Whitmore had ever been arrested, served in the military, or worked in certain government positions, his DNA would be on file. While waiting for DNA results, Detective Wong focused on locating Marcus Sullivan. The research analyst Kevin Park had already begun preliminary searches. Marcus Sullivan, born January 8, 1948, in Los Angeles, had worked at the Brentwood Country Club from May through November 1970. Unlike Daniel Whitmore, Marcus had not vanished completely. Tax records showed he had worked various security jobs throughout the 1970s and 1980s. He married in 1975, divorced in 1982, and had 1 daughter. Property records indicated he owned a small house in Pasadena, purchased in 1995. Detective Wong drove to the Pasadena address on Saturday morning. The house sat on a quiet street, lined with mature oak trees, a modest single-story structure with a well-maintained lawn. Wong knocked on the door and waited. After a moment, a woman in her mid-40s answered. She introduced herself as Rachel Sullivan, Marcus's daughter. Her expression grew troubled when Wong showed his badge and explained the reason for his visit. Rachel invited him inside and delivered news that complicated the investigation further. Marcus Sullivan had died 3 months earlier, in July 2025, from a heart attack. He was 77 years old. Detective Wong expressed condolences and explained that he needed to ask questions about events from 1970. Rachel said her father had rarely spoken about that time in his life, but she would help however she could. Wong asked if Marcus had ever mentioned Daniel Whitmore. Rachel's eyes widened with recognition. She said that name was one of the few things her father had discussed from his time at the country club. According to Rachel, Marcus had confessed something to her during his final weeks. He said he had witnessed something terrible in 1970, something that had haunted him his entire life, but he had been too afraid to report it. Rachel led Wong to her father's study, a small room filled with books and personal papers. She explained that after Marcus died, she had been sorting through his belongings and found something disturbing. She opened a drawer and removed a leather journal. Marcus had kept it hidden for 55 years. Rachel handed it to Wong, saying she had not shared it with anyone because she did not understand its significance until now. Detective Wong opened the journal carefully. The entries began in October 1970, written in Marcus's precise handwriting. The first entry was dated October 20th, the day before Victoria Ashford's murder. Marcus wrote that Daniel Whitmore had approached him with an unusual request. Daniel wanted Marcus to cover his security station at the front entrance for 30 minutes during the gala. In exchange, Daniel would pay Marcus $500, a substantial sum in 1970. Marcus had agreed, not understanding what he was facilitating. On the night of October 21st, at approximately 11 o'clock, Marcus took over Daniel's position at the front entrance. Daniel disappeared into the club, supposedly to use the restroom. But 30 minutes passed, then 45. Marcus grew worried. When Daniel finally returned at 11:50, his appearance was disheveled. His jacket was torn, and Marcus noticed what looked like soil on his shoes. Daniel thrust the $500 at Marcus and told him to forget the entire arrangement. He said if Marcus ever spoke about it, there would be consequences. The journal entries continued, documenting Marcus's growing suspicion and fear after Victoria's body was discovered. He wrote that he believed Daniel had killed her during those 45 minutes when Marcus was covering his position. But Marcus had taken the money, which made him complicit. He was terrified that if he came forward, he would be charged as an accessory. So he remained silent, quit his job and tried to forget. But the guilt consumed him. The journal contained page after page of Marcus, wrestling with his conscience, describing nightmares and anxiety that plagued him for decades. The final entry, written in July 2025, just weeks before Marcus's death, contained a revelation that changed everything. Marcus wrote that he had recently seen a news report about a businessman in San Francisco named David White, who was being honored for his charitable work. Marcus recognized him immediately. David White was Daniel Whitmore. Marcus had been following his career for years, watching as the man who had likely murdered Victoria Ashford built a respectable life under a new identity. Marcus wrote that he intended to contact the police, that he could no longer live with the secret. But death came before he could make that call. Detective Wong photographed every page of the journal and immediately contacted Detective Martinez. They now had a solid lead. David White of San Francisco, if he was truly Daniel Whitmore, could be located and questioned. But they needed to proceed carefully. If White had constructed a new identity, he had resources and connections. Approaching him prematurely could give him time to disappear again. Martinez decided they would conduct thorough background research on David White before making any contact. She wanted to know everything about this man, his business dealings, his associates, his movements over the past 55 years. Most importantly, she wanted DNA evidence that could definitively link David White to the letters sent to Catherine Blackwell. The investigation had reached a critical turning point. After 55 years, they were closing in on Victoria Ashford's killer. David White lived in Pacific Heights, one of San Francisco's most exclusive neighborhoods, in a Victorian mansion valued at $12 million. At 80 years old, he had become a pillar of the Bay Area community. His company, White Security Solutions, employed over 300 people and provided security services to corporations, museums, and high-profile individuals throughout California. He sat on the boards of 3 charitable organizations, donated generously to the arts, and had received commendations from the mayor for his philanthropic work. On the surface, David White was beyond reproach. Detective Martinez assigned Kevin Park to compile a comprehensive background on White. Kevin worked methodically, building a timeline that stretched back to 1971, the year after Victoria Ashford's murder. David White had appeared in San Francisco with seemingly no history. He obtained a business license, opened a small security consulting firm, and began building his empire. Early news articles described him as a self-made entrepreneur with innovative ideas about personal protection. By 1980, his company had expanded significantly. By 1990, he was a millionaire. By 2000, he was one of the most respected businessmen in Northern California. But the absence of any records before 1971 stood out like a beacon. No birth certificate, no school records, no employment history. David White, like Daniel Whitmore before him, seemed to have materialized from nothing. Kevin dug deeper, searching for the connections that would prove these two men were the same person. He found it in a small detail most people would overlook. In 1973, David White had been involved in a minor car accident. The police report included his driver's license information, height 6 feet 2 inches, brown hair, blue eyes, born March 15, 1945. The birth date matched Daniel Whitmore's exactly. Detective Martinez knew they needed more than circumstantial evidence. She needed DNA. The problem was obtaining a sample from David White without alerting him to the investigation. She consulted with the district attorney's office about legal options. They could not compel him to provide DNA without probable cause, and their evidence, while suggestive, did not yet rise to that level. They needed a different approach. Detective Wong suggested surveillance. If they could collect a discarded item that White had touched, a coffee cup from a cafe or a napkin from a restaurant, they could extract DNA without his knowledge. Martinez approved the plan. She assigned 2 undercover officers to monitor White's movements and collect any possible sample. The surveillance began on Monday morning. David White maintained a predictable routine. Each weekday at 7:30, he left his mansion and drove to his office in the financial district. He usually stopped at the same coffee shop, a small establishment on California Street. He ordered the same drink, a black coffee, no sugar. The undercover officers positioned themselves nearby, watching and waiting. On Wednesday morning, they got their opportunity. White finished his coffee, disposed of the cup in a public trash receptacle outside the shop, and continued to his office. The moment he turned the corner, one officer retrieved the cup, carefully bagging it as evidence. Dr. Reynolds received the coffee cup that afternoon. She extracted DNA from the rim where White's lips had touched. The analysis took 18 hours. When the results came back, they provided the confirmation Martinez had been seeking. The DNA from David White's coffee cup matched the DNA from the letters sent to Catherine Blackwell. David White and Daniel Whitmore were the same person. More significantly, Dr. Reynolds had run the DNA through additional databases and found something unexpected. The DNA showed a familial match to evidence collected at the Victoria Ashford crime scene in 1970. Martinez reviewed the original evidence reports carefully. Among the items collected from Victoria's body were skin cells found under her fingernails. She had scratched her attacker. In 1970, those cells could not be analyzed meaningfully, but they had been preserved. Dr. Reynolds compared them to David White's DNA. The results were conclusive. David White's DNA was present on Victoria Ashford's body. He had killed her. Detective Martinez now had sufficient evidence to obtain an arrest warrant. She met with the district attorney, presenting the DNA evidence, Marcus Sullivan's journal, Catherine Blackwell's testimony, and the enhanced photograph from the gala. The district attorney agreed they had a strong case. A judge issued the warrant that evening. Martinez assembled a tactical team for the arrest, knowing that a man who had successfully hidden his identity for 55 years might attempt to flee. The arrest was scheduled for Thursday morning. Martinez wanted to take White at his office, in a controlled environment with witnesses present. The plan was simple: enter the building, identify themselves, and place him under arrest. But Martinez prepared for complications. She coordinated with San Francisco Police Department to ensure backup was available. She had officers positioned at White's home in case he somehow learned of the impending arrest and tried to escape. Every detail was considered, every contingency planned. On Thursday at 9 o'clock, Detective Martinez, Detective Wong, and 4 uniformed officers entered the lobby of the building that housed White Security Solutions. They took the elevator to the 10th floor, where White's executive office was located. His assistant, a young woman named Jennifer, greeted them with confusion. Martinez showed her badge and asked to see David White immediately. Jennifer's face went pale. She picked up her phone, but Martinez stopped her. They would announce themselves. Martinez opened the door to White's private office. David White sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, reviewing documents. He looked up, and for a moment his expression registered surprise. Then something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, understanding. He had been expecting this day for 55 years. Martinez identified herself and stated that David White, also known as Daniel Whitmore, was under arrest for the murder of Victoria Ashford. She read him his rights while Detective Wong handcuffed him. White said nothing. He simply nodded, almost with relief, as if a burden he had carried for decades was finally being lifted. The interrogation room at LAPD headquarters was windowless and sparse, containing only a metal table and 4 chairs. David White sat on one side, his hands folded calmly on the table, He had waived his right to an attorney, saying he wanted to talk. Detective Martinez and Detective Wong sat across from him, a recording device capturing every word. Martinez studied the man before her. At 80, White showed his age, but he maintained the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His silver hair was neatly combed, his expensive suit perfectly tailored. Only his eyes betrayed him, revealing a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. Martinez began by stating the evidence they had collected, the DNA match, Marcus Sullivan's journal, Catherine Blackwell's testimony, the letters. She laid out the case methodically, watching White's reaction to each revelation. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if checking off items on a mental list. When Martinez finished, she asked him directly if he had killed Victoria Ashford. White was silent for a long moment. Then he said yes. The confession, when it came, was delivered in a voice that was steady, but filled with an emotion Martinez could not quite identify. Regret, perhaps mixed with something else. White explained that he needed to start at the beginning, to make them understand the context of what happened that October night. Martinez told him to take his time. They had waited 55 years for the truth. A few more hours would not matter. David White, born Daniel Whitmore, explained that in 1970 he had been a different person. He came from poverty, raised in Sacramento by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed. He never knew his father. At 25, he was struggling, working low-wage security jobs and dreaming of something better. When his Aunt Catherine helped him get the position at the Brentwood Country Club, he saw it as an opportunity to observe how the wealthy lived, to learn their secrets and perhaps find a way to join their ranks. But the job had brought him into contact with people far more dangerous than he anticipated. White paused here, choosing his words carefully. He said that approximately 1 month before the gala, he was approached by a man named Richard Prescott. Prescott was a member of the country club, a businessman with connections throughout Los Angeles. Prescott offered White $10,000 to do a simple job, deliver a package to Victoria Ashford during the autumn gala, and ensure she opened it immediately. White, desperate for money, agreed without asking questions. It was only later that he understood the true nature of what Prescott wanted. The package contained photographs. White did not know what they depicted until Victoria opened it in the garden that night. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She screamed. White said the photographs showed evidence of illegal activities involving several prominent Los Angeles businessmen and politicians. Victoria, who had been investigating corruption as part of her activism work, had gotten too close to the truth. The photographs were meant to scare her into silence. But Victoria was not someone who scared easily. White continued, his voice growing quieter. He said Victoria looked at him with fury and told him she was going to the police immediately. She would expose everyone involved, including him. White panicked. He had taken Prescott's money, which made him part of the conspiracy. If Victoria went to the police, he would be arrested. His desperation turned to rage. He told her she could not do that, but Victoria pushed past him, heading toward the ballroom. That was when everything went wrong. White said he grabbed her arm to stop her. She pulled away and slapped him. He reacted without thinking, his hands going to her throat. He insisted he did not plan to kill her, that he only meant to restrain her, to reason with her. But his grip was too strong, and Victoria struggled. The sedative she had unknowingly consumed earlier in the evening, slipped into her champagne by someone working with Prescott, made her weak. Within moments, she stopped fighting. White realized what he had done, but it was too late. Victoria Ashford was dead. Detective Martinez asked White about the sedative. Who had drugged Victoria? White said he did not know for certain, but he suspected it was arranged by Prescott. The plan had always been more elaborate than White understood. He was simply the instrument, the expendable tool. After killing Victoria, White had run to Prescott in terror, confessing what happened. Prescott did not seem surprised or upset. Instead, he gave White instructions. Leave Los Angeles immediately. Never return. Prescott would ensure the evidence disappeared and that witnesses provided convenient alibis. In exchange, White would receive $50,000 and a new identity. White explained that Prescott had connections that reached into law enforcement and government. Creating a new identity for David White was simple for someone with those resources. White took the money, moved to San Francisco, and built his life. But the guilt never left him. The letters he sent to Catherine were not threats, but confessions. He needed someone to know, to share the burden of what he had done. Catherine never responded, but she never told anyone either, which White interpreted as a kind of absolution. Detective Wong asked the question that had been bothering him throughout the confession. If Prescott arranged everything, where was he now? White's answer sent a chill through the room. Richard Prescott had died in 1998, taking his secrets with him. But White revealed something that explained why the original investigation had failed so completely. Detective Raymond Fletcher, the lead investigator in 1970, had been one of Prescott's associates. Fletcher had deliberately misdirected the investigation, ensuring it went nowhere. The corruption Victoria had been investigating reached far deeper than anyone suspected, extending into the police department itself. Martinez felt a cold anger settle over her. Fletcher had betrayed everything the badge represented. But he was beyond justice now, dead for 27 years. The question remained, who else had been involved? White said he knew of at least 5 other men who were part of Prescott's network in 1970. 2 were dead. 3 were still alive, still powerful, still protected by their wealth and connections. White said he would provide their names on one condition. He wanted protection for Catherine Blackwell. She had carried his secret but committed no crime. Martinez agreed. White wrote down 3 names that would shock Los Angeles society. The 3 names David White wrote on the paper represented some of the most powerful individuals in California. The first was Harold Brennan, now 92 years old, a former state senator who had served 4 terms and was widely regarded as a champion of education reform. The second was Thomas Ashford, Victoria's younger brother, now 73, who had inherited his father's real estate empire and expanded it into one of the largest property development companies on the West Coast. The third name was perhaps the most shocking. Judge Elizabeth Morrison, 85, a retired Superior Court judge who had been celebrated throughout her career for her integrity and fairness. Detective Martinez stared at the names, particularly the second one. Thomas Ashford had been 18 when his sister was murdered. He had publicly sworn to find her killer. How could he have been involved in her death? White explained that Thomas had not participated in the murder itself, but he had been part of Prescott's network. Victoria had discovered that her own brother was involved in the corruption she was investigating. Thomas had provided Prescott with information about Victoria's investigation, not realizing it would lead to her death. When she was killed, Thomas was devastated but also terrified. If anyone learned of his involvement, his life would be destroyed. Prescott assured him that silence was the only option, and Thomas complied. Harold Brennan had been a rising politician in 1970, ambitious and willing to compromise his principles for advancement. Prescott had photographs of Brennan accepting bribes from construction companies seeking government contracts. When Victoria began investigating municipal corruption, Brennan feared exposure. He was present at a meeting where Prescott proposed silencing Victoria permanently. Brennan did not explicitly agree to murder, but he did not object either. His silence made him complicit. Judge Morrison's involvement was more complex. In 1970, she was a young prosecutor named Elizabeth Chen. She had been romantically involved with Prescott, unaware of the full extent of his criminal activities. When Victoria's murder occurred, Prescott told Elizabeth that he had evidence placing her at the scene, fabricated evidence that could ruin her career. He blackmailed her into ensuring the case remained unsolved, using her position within the district attorney's office to subtly undermine the investigation. She provided Fletcher with misdirection, suggested dead-end leads, and ensured key evidence was never properly analyzed. Detective Martinez knew that prosecuting these individuals would be extraordinarily difficult. White's testimony was that of a confessed murderer trying to implicate others. Defense attorneys would tear him apart. Moreover, the crimes occurred 55 years ago, and statutes of limitations applied to many offenses. Murder had no statute of limitations, but conspiracy charges would be challenging to prove. Martinez needed corroborating evidence, something that directly linked these 3 individuals to the plot against Victoria Ashford. She returned to the original case files with fresh eyes, knowing now what to look for. Among the hundreds of pages of documents, she found anomalies that suddenly made sense. A witness statement from Harold Brennan that placed him at the opposite end of the country club from where another witness saw him. A memo from Elizabeth Chen recommending the investigation focus on Victoria's activist connections rather than her corruption investigation. A financial record showing Thomas Ashford had received a significant cash payment from an offshore account 2 weeks after his sister's death. Detective Wong began the process of re-interviewing these 3 individuals, starting with Thomas Ashford. Wong and Martinez arrived at Ashford's Beverly Hills office unannounced. Thomas Ashford looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment his entire adult life. When they asked to speak with him about his sister's murder, he did not act surprised. He dismissed his assistant and closed the office door. He said he knew this day would eventually come. Thomas's confession was delivered with tears streaming down his face. He said not a day had passed in 55 years when he did not think about Victoria. He explained that in 1970 he was young and stupid, involved with people who promised him wealth and power. He gave Prescott information about Victoria's investigation, never imagining it would lead to her murder. When she died, Thomas wanted to confess, but Prescott threatened to kill him and their parents. Thomas lived in fear for years, even after Prescott's death, worrying that others in the network would silence him if he spoke. Thomas said he had tried to atone through charitable work, donating millions to causes Victoria cared about, funding scholarships in her name, supporting civil rights organizations, but no amount of money could erase his guilt or bring his sister back. He offered to cooperate fully with the investigation, to testify against the others, and to accept whatever punishment the law required. Martinez recorded his statement and explained he would need to retain an attorney. Thomas said he would surrender his passport and would not flee. He had been running from the truth for too long. Harold Brennan's response was entirely different. When detectives arrived at his estate in Malibu, Brennan refused to speak without his attorney present. His lawyer, a high-powered criminal defense specialist, immediately invoked Brennan's Fifth Amendment rights. Brennan would not be providing any statements or cooperating with the investigation. The attorney suggested in thinly veiled terms that the prosecution had nothing but the word of a confessed murderer and the guilt-ridden ramblings of Thomas Ashford. Without physical evidence directly linking Brennan to the conspiracy, securing a conviction would be nearly impossible. Judge Elizabeth Morrison lived alone in a modest apartment in Pasadena, far removed from the opulence that characterized the lives of Brennan and Ashford. When Detective Martinez and Detective Wong knocked on her door on a Saturday morning, she answered immediately. Unlike Brennan, she did not call an attorney. Unlike Thomas, she did not break down in tears. Instead, she invited them inside and offered them coffee with the calm dignity that had defined her judicial career. Elizabeth sat across from the detectives in her small living room, surrounded by law books and framed photographs of her grandchildren. She looked at Martinez with weary eyes and said she had been expecting them. She explained that when she heard about David White's arrest on the news, she knew her past would finally catch up with her. For 55 years, she had lived with the knowledge of what she had done, and the weight had grown unbearable with each passing year. Her confession was delivered with the precision of someone trained in law. She acknowledged that Richard Prescott had blackmailed her into undermining the Victoria Ashford investigation. She admitted to providing Detective Fletcher with misleading information, to ensuring certain evidence was overlooked, and to discouraging witnesses from coming forward. She said that every case she presided over as a judge, every decision she made from the bench, had been colored by the knowledge that she was a fraud. She had built a reputation for justice while hiding a terrible injustice. Elizabeth explained that she had tried to compensate in small ways. She had been particularly harsh on corruption cases, sentencing white-collar criminals to maximum penalties. She had championed reforms in the criminal justice system, advocating for transparency and accountability. But she knew these actions did not absolve her. Nothing could. She said she welcomed prosecution, that facing consequences was perhaps the only way she could find peace before she died. For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.